Details in the investigation into the murders of 4 people in a small Nebraska town. We told you last night about the arrest of Carrie Jones. She's the wife of murder suspect Jason Jones. In new documents, it's alleged that she killed one of the victims and then helped her husband hide evidence of those crimes. Back in August, 4 people were found murdered in their homes, which were then purposefully set on fire. Investigators say they examined Carrie and Jason's phones and discovered new information indicating Carrie played a role prior to those murders.